Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the greatest tool for building middle class wealth for your parents' generation has been intentionally re engineered into a system that favors corporations over families? And what if I told you that this wasn't an accident, but the result of specific decisions that have turned a basic human need into a high stakes global casino? For a significant portion of the 20th century, the concept of homeownership in developed nations was not a question of if, but when. It was a foundational pillar of the middle class dream, a tangible marker of stability and success. The boomer generation, those who came of age in the post war economic expansion, largely viewed the purchase of a house as a normal, accessible part of life. It was the bedrock upon which one built a family, invested in a community, and secured a comfortable future. They often recount stories of buying their first homes at prices that seem bafflingly low to modern ears in a market with little competition. This narrative, however, has fractured, replaced by a modern reality that feels like a cruel inversion of that bygone dream. Today, a vast and growing portion of the population finds itself locked out. The dream of ownership has been supplanted by the immediate, crushing weight of monthly rent. For millions, the idea of saving a down payment is a financial impossibility when rent alone consumes an unsustainable percentage of their income. Even those who manage to secure a mortgage in recent years often find themselves in a precarious position, struggling to keep up with high payments in an economy of stagnant wages and rising costs. This generational divide between those who bought in an era of accessibility and those who are now tenants in an era of exclusion has become a defining feature of modern society. This crisis is not a localized anomaly confined to one or two overpriced cities. It is a systemic global phenomenon. In affluent developed nations across the spectrum, from Canada and the United States to Australia and much of Western Europe, the story is strikingly similar. Housing prices have decoupled from the economic reality of the people who live and work in these countries. Prices have not just risen, they have exploded, far outpacing the average incomes of the working population. The consequence is stark and undeniable. Home ownership is becoming an unattainable luxury reserved for a shrinking elite. The data paints a picture not of a slowdown, but of a market collapse for new buyers. According to a comprehensive report by Redfin, in the United States, a staggering 60% of homes for sale in the year 2021 were considered affordable for the average family. Just 1 year later, in 2022, that number had plummeted to a mere 21%. In the span of 12 months, two-thirds of the affordable housing stock vanished, evaporating into a market that no longer serves the average citizen. This is, by many metrics, the lowest point for housing affordability in history, forcing a critical examination of how the entire system became so fundamentally rigged. That forces us to ask the big question: how did the system get so rigged? To truly understand the current crisis, you first have to understand the profound philosophical shift in what a house even represents. The unaffordability of today isn't the result of a single policy, but the culmination of a decades-long transformation, changing the very soul of the housing market. We have moved from an era of home to an era of asset, and this distinction is the key to the entire problem. In the past, specifically in the post-war decades, like the 1960s, the primary function of a house was shelter. It was a consumption good, a place to live, raise a family, and feel a sense of stability and belonging. While it was understood that a home might appreciate in value, it was not its main purpose. It was not viewed as a speculative tool or a primary vehicle for getting rich. This ethos was reflected in the economics of the time. In most developed nations, the median house cost was closely aligned with median income, typically costing around 2 to 3 times the median person's yearly salary. This ratio meant that a single, stable income was often sufficient to buy a home. This accessibility was frequently supported by government policy, such as the GI Bill in the United States, which actively promoted family home ownership for returning veterans, viewing it as a social good and a cornerstone of a healthy society. The present era operates on a completely different paradigm. The house is no longer primarily a home, it is first and foremost a financial instrument, an asset to be invested in, leveraged, and traded. This mindset has permeated every corner of the market. The new ballooned price to income ratio tells the story. In the United States, the median house now costs between 5 to 6 times the median household income. This statistic is crucial. Where one individual income was once enough, now two full household incomes are insufficient to meet a ratio that has more than doubled. In high cost cities, the situation is even more dire, with prices regularly exceeding 8 times household income. This shift from home to asset created a feedback loop that has reshaped our very cities. When housing is treated as an investment, the incentive is to maximize its financial return. Developers and builders, responding rationally to this new incentive, shifted their focus. Why build modest, affordable starter homes for a small profit margin when you can build large luxury homes for a massive one? The small, simple homes that allowed previous generations to get a foothold in the market began to disappear, replaced by high end properties designed not for the local workforce, but for a global class of investors. The older generation, who had bought their homes when they were cheap, watched as their net worth soared, cementing the idea that a house was the best investment one could possibly make. The mindset took over, and as it did, the dream of an affordable home for the average person began to die. So we've established that the dream is dying. But why? What's actually driving this? The crisis of our time isn't born from just one single cause, but from a perfect storm of three powerful interlocking forces. These three theories supply constraint, speculation, and financialization, explain how the market can simultaneously freeze out buyers while prices continue their relentless climb. First is the theory of construction failure, a simple but devastating breakdown in supply and demand. In a healthy market, as the population grows and more people form new households, the construction of new homes would rise to meet that demand. Our market is not healthy. For decades, the construction of new homes, particularly affordable and high density ones, has failed to keep up with population growth and the demographic shifts towards smaller households and increased urbanization. This failure is not an accident. It is a feature of a system plagued by critical bottlenecks. The most significant of these are restrictive zoning laws and the political force of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Many cities are trapped in archaic zoning codes that explicitly ban the construction of apartments, duplexes, or any high density housing in vast swaths of residential land. These laws are fiercely protected by existing homeowners, the NIMBYs. These individuals, while perhaps agreeing in principle that more housing is needed, actively lobby and protest to block any new developments in their own neighborhoods. They fear that new apartments will increase traffic, strain local services, or most importantly, cause the value of their own property to decline. This creates a deeply damaging collective action problem. While each homeowner acts rationally to protect their personal asset, the collective outcome is a chokehold on new supply, which guarantees that prices for everyone, including their own children, will continue to skyrocket. The power of this mechanism is best proven by its inverse. The city of Auckland, New Zealand, provides a rare and compelling case study. Facing its own severe affordability crisis, the city took the radical step of upzoning roughly 75% of its residential land, effectively legalizing the construction of higher density apartment buildings and townhomes, where only single family homes were once allowed. The results were dramatic and immediate. While the rest of New Zealand saw its rent to income ratio continue to climb, Auckland's dropped. They had addressed the supply constraint head on, and it worked. This supply problem is exacerbated by other market dysfunctions. Developers, even when land is zoned correctly, often engage in land hoarding. They will purchase viable land and deliberately sit on it, sometimes for years, restricting the supply. They wait for the perfect moment when prices have risen even further, allowing them to maximize their profit on the eventual sale. Finally, the construction process itself has become a gauntlet of inefficiency. It is slow, expensive, and fraught with delays from bureaucratic permit issues, the rising and volatile costs of building materials, and persistent labor shortages. Now, that's the first part of the problem. We're just not building enough. But the second driver is the speculation game. This theory posits that the demand driving up prices isn't coming from people who need a place to live, but from investors who see housing as a speculative asset, no different from a stock or a bar of gold. This introduces a toxic dynamic into the market. In a normal market, if a good, like a car, becomes too expensive, demand falls and the price corrects downward. In a speculative housing market, the opposite happens. Rising prices are seen as proof of a hot investment which attracts more speculators. This new wave of investor money then drives prices even higher, which in turn attracts even more speculators. It becomes a dangerous positive feedback loop, completely detached from the local economy or what residents can afford. This process can lead to the bizarre and frustrating phenomenon of soaring prices and rising vacancies at the same time, a situation seen in markets like China and, in the early 2000s, the United States. This speculative fever gives rise to zombie houses. These are properties, often single-family homes, that are purchased by investors, either foreign or domestic, and are intentionally left empty. The owner has no intention of living there or even renting the property out. Its sole purpose is to appreciate in value. These empty homes, sitting dark on residential streets, are a physical manifestation of the supply shortage. They are homes that are actively withheld from the market, making the shortage for actual families even more acute. And that brings us to the third and final driver, the financialization of housing, or what I call the cheap money theory. If supply constraints are the bottleneck and speculation is the artificial demand, financialization is the high octane fuel poured on the fire. This theory argues that decades of loosened mortgage regulations and, more recently, historically low interest rates have flooded the housing market with a tsunami of cheap credit. This process began in earnest in the 1980s when many governments, with the stated good intention of making homeownership more accessible, began to liberalize mortgage markets. They relaxed lending standards and made it easier for banks to lend vast sums of money. The critical flaw in this logic, however, was that this new massive pool of credit was not earmarked for the construction of new houses. Instead, it was unleashed on the existing housing stock. The result was inevitable. Far more money began chasing the exact same number of houses. This did not, in the long run, create more homeowners. It simply created far more expensive houses and a mountain of household debt. This financialization is what props up the down payment illusion, a subtle trap that masks the true state of unaffordability. Lenders and banks, heavily invested in the continuation of the housing boom, understand that a traditional 20% down payment is now impossible for most. To keep the machine running, they have progressively lowered the barrier to entry. The average down payment for a first time home buyer in the US is now just 7%. Some lenders, like Zillow, have even trialed programs offering a 1% down payment. This serves a dual purpose. It allows buyers to feel like the market is still accessible while simultaneously allowing prices to continue to detach from incomes. A person who could never afford a $500,000 house can be convinced they can afford a $5,000 down payment, committing them to a lifetime of debt on an inflated asset. This mechanism keeps the bubble inflating, pushing the true price of homes to multiples that would have been unimaginable just a generation ago. Now, if regular families are being priced out, you have to wonder, who is buying everything? Well, as regular families are priced out, a new class of buyer has swept in to take their place. The competition is no longer just with other families saving for a down payment. The new competition is global, corporate, and possesses nearly limitless capital. The new landlords are not your neighbors. They are, in many cases, the faceless algorithms of Wall Street. The most profound change has been the rise of the corporate landlord. The mom and pop landlord, who might own one or two rental properties, is being systematically replaced by massive institutional investors. Wall Street private equity firms like Blackstone and dedicated real estate corporations like Invitation Homes have, in the years following the 2008 financial crisis, gone on an unprecedented buying spree. They now own not just apartment buildings, but tens or even hundreds of thousands of single family homes across the country. Their business model is simple: buy up the housing stock and convert it into a permanent portfolio of rentals. These corporations, with their ability to pay in cash and outbid any normal family, are no longer just participating in the market. They are making the market. This corporate consolidation is happening at all levels. It is estimated that investors, ranging from small scale flippers to these massive corporations, now purchase one out of every four homes sold. They are competing directly with first time buyers for the same limited inventory of starter homes, and they are winning. This trend is amplified by two other powerful forces. The first is the REIT, Real Estate Investment Trust. REITs function like index funds for property, allowing individual investors to buy shares in a large portfolio of real estate assets. This has created a perverse incentive. People who find themselves unable to afford a home can now invest their savings in a REIT that profits from the very unaffordability that locks them out. The popularity of residential REITs has channeled billions of dollars of new capital from the stock market directly into the housing market, funding the further acquisition of homes and pushing prices even higher in a vicious, self perpetuating cycle. The second force is the short term rental market, epitomized by platforms like Airbnb. An increasing number of properties, especially in desirable urban and tourist areas, are being removed from the long term rental market entirely. They are purchased by investors for the sole purpose of being used as mini hotels, rented out by the night to tourists. As seen in cities from Lisbon to Barcelona, this hollowing out of the residential housing stock has a devastating impact on local residents. It removes critical supply, driving up rents for everyone else and transforming vibrant neighborhoods into transient tourist zones. Alongside these corporate and speculative forces, two other groups of buyers are keeping the market active even as interest rates rise. The first is all cash buyers. These are often boomers or other long-time owners who are cashing in on the massive equity they've built over decades. Having bought their homes for a fraction of their current worth, they can sell at an enormous profit and use that cash to buy a new, smaller home outright. They are completely insulated from the high interest rate mortgage market that has frozen out new buyers, allowing them to dictate prices. The second group is interstate movers. This phenomenon involves people fleeing the most high cost of living H-coal cities like San Francisco or New York and moving to traditionally cheaper areas of the country. They bring with them the high incomes or remote work salaries from their H-coal jobs. When they arrive in their new city, they are able to arbitrage the market, paying far more for a home than the local population can afford. In the process of escaping their own affordability crisis, they inadvertently export it, pushing up local prices and displacing the residents of their new communities. But you have to understand, this isn't just an economic crisis. It's also a crisis of culture and narrative. A system this dysfunctional is often protected by a series of false narratives that shift blame onto individuals while powerful systemic traps lock them in place. The most pervasive of these is the avocado toast fallacy. This is the common refrain, often directed at younger generations, that their inability to buy a home is a result of personal financial irresponsibility. If you just stopped buying expensive coffee, the argument goes, or canceled your streaming subscriptions and worked harder, you could afford a house. This narrative is a insidious form of victim blaming. It reframes a systemic failure as a personal failing. The reality, as the data shows, is that no amount of personal austerity can bridge the chasm that has opened between wages and housing costs. The average home in many markets now earns as much in capital appreciation per year as the average person earns in salary. An individual cannot outsave an asset that is appreciating at the rate of their entire income. This narrative conveniently ignores the structural forces at play, the zoning laws, the corporate speculation, the decades of financialization, and places the entire burden of a broken system on the shoulders of the individual. A second, more subtle systemic trap is the double income phenomenon. When the two income household first became common, it was seen as an option, a way for a family to dramatically increase its standard of living, afford more luxuries, and save more for the future. It was a choice that provided a significant advantage. Over time, however, as the market adjusted to this new higher level of household income, this choice became an obligation. The housing market, in its relentless upward march, absorbed all of that extra income. Today, two full time salaries are the baseline requirement to afford the same modest home that one salary could secure decades ago. This is not progress, it is a societal rat race where families have to work twice as hard just to stay in the same place. This system has collateral damage. It brutally penalizes single people who are now competing against the financial power of two income couples. It punishes single parent households and makes it financially ruinous for one parent to take time off to raise children. The option has become a requirement, and the net gain in quality of life has been funneled almost entirely into the inflated value of property assets. Finally, the market is now defined by the trap of the golden handcuffs. In the past 2 years, as central banks have raised interest rates to combat inflation, the housing market has become frozen. This is because millions of existing homeowners are locked into 30-year fixed mortgages with historically low interest rates, many less than 3%. They are, in effect, trapped. They cannot sell their homes, even if they want to move, because doing so would mean buying a new home at the current, much higher interest rate. This would cause their monthly payments to double or even triple. This refusal to sell is not irrational. It is the only sane financial decision, but it has brought the entire market to a screeching halt. The inventory of homes for sale has collapsed. This lack of supply forces even more people, those who would have been buyers, into the rental market. This new desperate demand for rentals, competing in a market already constrained by corporate landlords and Airbnb conversions, causes rents to explode. In this way, the very policy designed to cool the market for renters made the affordability crisis even more painful. But the consequences of this system-wide failure extend far beyond the numbers on a balance sheet or the frustrations of a frozen market. The true cost of this crisis isn't just financial. It's social, demographic, and psychological. It is a slow motion hollowing out of the very fabric of society, changing not just where we live, but how we live and fundamentally who we are. Perhaps the most profound impact is on our demographic future. Across the developed world, young people are delaying or foregoing major life milestones, not out of choice, but out of sheer economic necessity. The decision to get married, and even more critically, the decision to have children, is now an economic calculation that for many simply doesn't add up. You cannot start a family in a one-bedroom apartment shared with two roommates. You cannot build a nursery when you're uncertain if a massive rent hike will force you to move in 6 months. The biological clock is running a desperate race against a financial clock that is rigged to move faster. This isn't just a personal tragedy repeated millions of times over, it's a demographic time bomb. We are inadvertently engineering a future with a shrinking workforce, a depleted tax base, and a generation trapped in a state of permanent financial adolescence. This ties directly to the erosion of our communities. The American dream was never just about owning property. It was about putting down roots. It was about joining the PTA, knowing your neighbors, coaching the local Little League team, and feeling a sense of belonging and investment in a place. Home ownership, or at least stable long-term tenancy, provided that stability. Today, we are becoming a nation of transients. When entire neighborhoods are owned by remote corporate landlords who see tenants as line items on a spreadsheet, or when homes are fragmented into short-term Airbnb rentals, that social capital evaporates. No one plants a tree when they know they won't be there to see it grow. No one bothers to learn their neighbor's name. This atomization leaves us disconnected, isolated, and far less resilient as a society. The crisis also creates a new suffocating kind of economic and geographic immobility. We've talked about the golden handcuffs that trap owners in their homes, but the iron grip of high rent traps renters in their jobs. In an affordable market, an individual has the freedom to take risks. They can quit a soul crushing job to start a new business, go back to school, or pursue a passion. But when 30, 40, or even 50% of your income is consumed by rent, you have no margin for error. You are chained to the bad job, the bad boss, and the bad situation because one missed paycheck could mean eviction. This job lock stifles entrepreneurship, kills innovation, and deadens the human spirit. Furthermore, the classic American story of moving for opportunity, packing up, and heading to a boom town is over. You can't move to a high growth city for a better job if you can't afford the rent on arrival. Our workforce is becoming less dynamic, trapped in place by the sheer cost of shelter. Finally, we cannot ignore the psychological and political fallout. Living with this constant background hum of housing insecurity inflicts a severe mental health toll. It is a state of perpetual anxiety, knowing that you are one rent hike, one medical emergency, or one car repair away from disaster. This chronic stress leads to burnout, depression, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness. And that hopelessness, that deep seated feeling that the game is rigged, is a political powder keg. It fuels the polarization and resentment that defines our modern era. It's no longer just left versus right, it's owners versus renters, boomers versus millennials. When an entire generation sees the ladder of opportunity being pulled up just as they reach for the first rung, they will understandably become very, very angry. That anger is shaking the foundations of our political institutions as desperate people search for anyone who promises to tear the whole rotten system down. So, after all of that, we're left with the biggest question of all: can this even be fixed? The housing crisis, driven by this toxic trifecta of supply constraints, rampant speculation, and systemic financialization, feels permanent. But it is not. The crisis was created by a series of policy choices, and it can be uncreated by a new, more courageous set. The solutions are known, it is the political will that is missing. Experts and urbanists consistently point to a handful of key policy reforms. The first is tax reform, specifically the implementation of a land value tax, LVT. Unlike a traditional property tax, which taxes both the land and the building on it, an LVT taxes only the value of the land itself. This simple change would powerfully realign incentives. It would make it prohibitively expensive for speculators to engage in land hoarding or to leave zombie houses empty on valuable urban land. It would reward building and development, not passive speculation. The second, and perhaps most critical, solution is zoning reform. The chokehold of NIMBYism must be broken. This means ending restrictive single family only zoning and legalizing the construction of more diverse, high density housing options like apartments, duplexes, and townhomes. As the Auckland example proved, allowing supply to meet demand is the most direct way to stabilize prices. Finally, the speculative nature of the market must be addressed through investor restrictions. This could include banning or placing severe limitations on the ability of large corporations and private equity firms to purchase single family homes. It could also mean implementing tax disincentives, such as ending the tax benefits and loopholes that encourage individuals and corporations to own multiple investment properties, thereby freeing up housing stock for first time buyers who actually intend to live in them. So, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't these common sense solutions being implemented? The roadblock is political. In most Western nations, the majority of voters are already homeowners. In the United States, for example, roughly 65% of Americans own their homes. These individuals and the politicians who rely on their votes are deeply resistant to any policy that might cause property prices to fall or even stagnate. A decline in housing values, while necessary to restore affordability, would be seen by this voting bloc as an attack on their primary source of net worth. Furthermore, no politician wants to risk a sudden price crash, which could be genuinely dangerous. A sharp drop in prices like the one seen in 2008 could plunge millions of recent buyers underwater, leaving them owing more on their mortgage than their home is worth. This fear of angering the home-owning majority and of triggering another financial crisis creates a political paralysis that allows the crisis to fester. In the end, the unaffordability of housing is not just about high prices. It is the symptom of a deep systemic change in our society's values. We have allowed the fundamental human need for shelter to be transformed into a speculative tool for financial extraction. The entire system, from local zoning boards to global financial markets, is now structured to protect the wealth of existing owners at the expense of aspiring ones. Unless we find the political courage to fix these broken fundamentals, to address supply, tame speculation, and recenter housing as a social good, renting will become the permanent new normal. The dream of home ownership, once the bedrock of the middle class, will be nothing more than a historical relic, a story told by an older generation about a world that no longer exists.